Mara Whitfield had been in her new cabin for exactly 14 hours, when 3 strangers let themselves through her unlocked front door without knocking. She was elbow-deep in a box marked Kitchen, Misk, still in the sweatpants she'd slept in, coffee cold on the counter, when she heard the door creak open and footsteps cross her threshold like they owned the place. She turned around holding a rolling pin she hadn't even unwrapped yet, and found a man in a golf polo and pleated khakis standing in her living room, flanked by a woman clutching a clipboard and another man filming the whole thing on his phone. "Mrs. Whitfield," the man in the polo said, not as a greeting but as an accusation. "It's Ms., Mara said, "and you're in my house." Dale Huffman, President, Timberline Ridge Cabin Owners Association. He said it the way other men might announce a rank in the military. "This isn't your house. Well, the structure is. The land under it is community property, and you are in violation of Section 7.4 of the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, as of 6:52 this morning, when our compliance officer photographed the unauthorized deck extension and privacy fencing installed by the previous owner without Architectural Review Committee approval." He held out a sheet of paper the way a man hands over a subpoena. Mara did not take it right away. She looked at the woman with the clipboard. Later, she'd learned this was Carol Vance, HOA treasurer, and at the man filming, who she'd learned was Roy Pemberton, HOA secretary and, apparently, the association's self-appointed documentarian. "I bought this cabin 11 days ago," Mara said. "I moved my furniture in yesterday. I haven't even found where you people put my box of forks." "Ignorance of the declaration is not a defense," Dale said. "It runs with the land. You signed for it at closing. I signed a stack of papers a foot thick. I didn't get a highlighter." Dale did not smile. Dale, Mara would come to learn, did not do humor. The fence and deck encroached 9 feet onto what the declaration designates as common recreational easement, adjoining the lake trail. That's a Section 9.3 encroachment violation, in addition to the Section 7.4 unauthorized structure violation. The fine schedule is $2,500 for the initial violation, effective today, plus $100 per day. The structures remain standing. You have 30 days to remove both, or the association will file a lien against the property and pursue foreclosure of the assessment lien under state law. Foreclosure. On day 2, Mara looked at the paper in his hand. Then she looked past him, out the window she'd only unpacked around 6 hours earlier, at the unauthorized deck. A perfectly normal cedar deck with a waist-high privacy fence, weathered silver by 10 years of mountain winters, exactly like 4 other decks she'd walked past on her way in from the parking lot the week she'd come up for the home inspection. "That deck's been there longer than I've owned a car," she said. "The last owner had it built in what, 2014? Where was the association then? The association's enforcement posture is not something I'm required to justify to you," Dale said. "I'm required to inform you of your violation and your 30-day cure period. That's what I'm doing." He set the notice on her kitchen counter, next to the unwrapped rolling pin, like he was placing a bill at the end of a meal nobody had asked to order. Then he turned, and Carol and Roy turned with him, and the 3 of them walked back out through the door they'd let themselves in through, without ever once acknowledging that they had, in fact, just entered a private residence, uninvited, on its owner's 2nd day of ownership. Mara stood in her kitchen for a long moment, holding a rolling pin she still hadn't unwrapped, looking at a piece of paper that used the word foreclosure before she'd even found her coffee mugs. "Welcome to Timberline Ridge. Drop your city, and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many of you are watching this from behind enemy lines right now." To understand how a woman could be threatened with foreclosure on her 2nd day in a house, you have to understand Timberline Ridge itself, because Timberline Ridge was never really a normal subdivision, and that fact would matter more than anyone in that clipboard and golf polo trio could have possibly imagined. The community sat in the hills above Laurel Fork, North Carolina, a town of about 6,000 people that existed mostly to sell gas, gear, and biscuits to tourists heading further up into the Blue Ridge. 62 cabins ringed a private lake called Whitfield Lake, a detail that would become considerably more relevant later, connected by a looping gravel road called Hollow Pine Trail, with a clubhouse, a boat launch, and a scatter of hiking easements cut through hemlock and rhododendron. The land had been developed back in 1958 by a timber and land man named Otis Whitfield, who bought 400 acres of mountainside for next to nothing, dammed a creek to make the lake that would bear his name, and started selling off cabin lots to doctors and lawyers from Charlotte and Winston-Salem looking for a mountain retreat. Otis never sold the underlying land outright. Instead, in 1962, he structured something a little unusual for the era: a 99-year ground lease. Cabin owners bought their structures and held a leasehold interest in their individual lots, paying a modest annual ground rent to the Whitfield Family Trust that held fee title to the whole 400 acres. Cabin lots, common areas, lake frontage, clubhouse, roads, all of it. The lease had a renegotiation clause every 20 years, allowing the ground rent and terms to be revisited by mutual agreement between the trust and the newly formed Cabin Owners Association, which took over day-to-day governance in 1971 as the Timberline Ridge Cabin Owners Association. Most of the people who bought cabins over the following decades didn't think much about the ground lease. It was a line item in the closing documents, a few $100s a year folded into HOA dues, a historical curiosity from back when the whole mountain belonged to one man. The Whitfield family, for their part, had mostly scattered, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who'd moved to Atlanta, Nashville, one to Seattle, and the trust had passed down through the generations quietly, administered by a Charlotte law firm, collecting its modest ground rent and otherwise staying out of the community's business entirely. Mara Whitfield had grown up hearing her mother mention a crazy great-uncle who dammed up a creek in the mountains, but she'd never been to Timberline Ridge, never met Otis, and by the time she was old enough to ask real questions about the family, Otis had been dead 11 years, and the story had calcified into the kind of half-myth every family has about a relative nobody quite remembers correctly. What Mara knew, in the spring she decided to buy Cabin 14, was this: she was 34, freshly divorced, working remotely as a claims auditor for a regional insurance company, and she wanted out of Charlotte and its two-bedroom apartment, full of furniture that used to be theirs and was now just hers by default. Her mother, Elaine Whitfield Doss, had passed away that June after a short illness, and among the modest things Mara inherited was a lump sum from something Elaine's paperwork called the Whitfield Family Trust, Corpus Distribution, administered by a firm called Ledbetter & Cross out of Charlotte. Mara had signed the paperwork the way you sign paperwork during a month when your mother has just died, quickly, exhausted, wanting it over, and had understood it only as, "My mother left me some money." 3 weeks later, scrolling a foreclosure auction site at 1 a.m., because sleep wasn't happening anyway, she found Cabin 14, Hollow Pine Trail, Laurel Fork, North Carolina, a 3-bedroom log cabin on a wooded half-acre above a lake, sold as is by the bank after the previous owner defaulted, listed at a price that, combined with her inheritance, she could actually afford outright. She had no idea the lake was named after her family. Nobody at the auction house mentioned it. Why would they? To them, Whitfield Lake was just a name on a map, same as Roosevelt Street or Jefferson Avenue, a name so baked into the landscape that nobody thought to ask where it came from. Cabin 14 wasn't much to look at from the road. A modest log structure with a green metal roof, a wraparound porch worn soft by 2 decades of mountain weather, and a view of the lake through a stand of hemlocks that made the whole half-acre feel, for the first time in a long time, like somewhere Mara might actually want to wake up. She'd walked through it during the home inspection in August, alone, running her hand along the porch rail, and had felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt since before the divorce, since before her mother's diagnosis, since before her whole life had become a series of things she was surviving rather than choosing. She wanted quiet. She wanted a porch and a lake, and a place nobody could reach her without an invitation. She closed on the cabin in September. She moved her furniture in on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, Dale Huffman let himself into her house. Her new next-door neighbor, an 81-year-old widow named Thelma Ann Ferris, who'd lived at Cabin 15 since 1988, watched the whole thing from her porch with the particular stillness of someone who has seen this movie before. "He do the walk-in without knocking thing?" Thelma asked, once Dale's truck had pulled away. "He did the walk-in without knocking thing," Mara confirmed, still holding the notice. "Yep, that's Dale's opener. Sit down, honey. You're gonna want the whole story, and it's not a short one." Over glasses of sweet tea that Mara hadn't asked for but badly needed, Thelma laid it out. Dale Huffman had been HOA president for 6 years, re-elected twice by a membership too tired or too intimidated to run anyone against him, in an association where meeting quorum requirements were so rarely met that most elections happened by a proxy count of maybe 11 cabins out of 62. He ran the Architectural Review Committee like a personal fiefdom, approved projects for people he liked, and cited violations against people he didn't. Usually new owners who hadn't yet learned the unwritten rule, which was, stay quiet, pay your dues, compliment Dale's landscaping, and you'll never hear from the association at all. "Half the decks on this road are the exact same setback as yours," Thelma said. "Ed Castellano's is worse. Nobody's touched Ed's deck in 9 years. But Ed brings Dale a bottle of good bourbon every Christmas, so it's selective," Mara said. "It's Dale," Thelma said, like that answered it. "New owners get the treatment first. He figures you don't know anybody yet, don't know the rules, and you'll just pay to make it go away. Most people do." Thelma poured more tea and kept going, because once Thelma started on Dale Huffman, she didn't stop halfway. Dale had bought his cabin, Lot 3, back in 2011, retired early from a regional bank where he'd spent 30 years as a branch manager, and had brought every ounce of that middle management energy with him into a volunteer position that by rights should have amounted to approving paint colors and mowing schedules twice a year. Instead, Dale had built Timberline Ridge's board into something closer to a personal court. He'd installed his own security camera at the entrance gate for the community's protection, which conveniently also let him track exactly which cars came and went and when. He'd pushed through a bylaw amendment in 2019, lowering quorum requirements from 20% to 10% of voting members, ostensibly to make meetings more efficient, which in practice meant a re-election could pass with the votes of a dozen loyal cabins, while the other 50 simply never showed up, never realizing their absence was the whole point. "Man's not evil exactly," Thelma said, chewing on the thought. "He's just never once in his life been told no, and he's decided he doesn't intend to start now. That's worse, in some ways. Evil you can see coming. This is just a man who genuinely believes the rules exist to be used on other people." Mara asked whether anyone had ever tried running against him. Priya Osei tried, 2 years back. Nice woman, Lot 31, 3 kids, works nights at the hospital in Boone. Dale had the ARC deny a bedroom addition she'd been planning for 8 months, citing a setback issue nobody had ever mentioned before, right around the time she announced her candidacy. She dropped out a month later. Never proved it was retaliation. Never had to. Everybody on this road understood exactly what had happened, and that was the point. It was, Mara would learn over the following weeks, a community quietly built on that exact kind of understanding. The 61 other cabins who paid their dues, kept their heads down, complimented Dale's tomato plants at the summer potluck, and simply hoped they'd never be the one whose deck, whose bedroom addition, whose dog, whose flag, whose paint color, caught Dale's attention on the wrong week. Now that you know Mara, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has ever done, because I promise you, this is only the beginning of hers. Mara did not pay to make it go away. What she did, instead, was read the entire notice twice, then drive into Laurel Fork and pay $11 to photocopy every page of the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions at the public library, because her own copy was still buried somewhere in a box marked Office. Later. Section 7.4c did, in fact, require Architectural Review Committee approval for decks, patios, and similar exterior structures exceeding 48 square feet. Section 9.3 defined the common recreational easement as a 15-foot buffer along the lakeside trail, within which no permanent structure could be built without a variance. Her deck, built by the previous owner in 2014, did appear to sit partially within that buffer, by roughly 6 feet, not the 9 Dale had claimed, but 6 feet was still a violation on paper. What was also true, and what Mara found within 20 minutes of pulling old ARC minutes archived at the library's local history desk, was that at least 4 other cabins along the lake trail had decks or sheds within the same buffer, none of which had ever received a violation notice in the association's records going back to 2016. Ed Castellano's shed at Cabin 22 sat a full 11 feet into the easement. The Osei family's screened porch at Cabin 31 was closer to the trail than Mara's deck by a full yard. The Delacroix cabin at Lot 9 had a fire pit and stone patio built entirely within the buffer in 2019, complete with a permit application that had simply never been acted on by the ARC, approved by default, essentially, through sheer bureaucratic neglect, and never once revisited. She called the HOA management office, a 2-person operation run out of a strip mall office in Laurel Fork, contracted by the board, and asked, politely, for clarification on enforcement history. The woman on the phone, a harried part-timer named Denise, said she wasn't authorized to discuss other owners' compliance records, which Mara understood to mean, yes, obviously, this is selective, and no, I'm not allowed to admit it. On October 3rd, Mara attended her first Timberline Ridge board meeting, held in the clubhouse's meeting room under a taxidermied base and a portrait of Otis Whitfield that nobody in the room, including Mara, thought twice about. 11 homeowners showed up out of 62, which the bylaws apparently considered sufficient quorum, since the bylaws set quorum at 10% of voting members, a bar so low it might as well not exist. Mara requested 5 minutes on the agenda to discuss the violation. Dale granted her 3. I'd like to understand the enforcement standard, she said, standing at the podium in front of 11 neighbors and a dead fish. Because I count 4 other properties on this road, with structures at least as far into the easement as mine, none of which have ever been cited. I'm asking, respectfully, why mine is the one that got a same-week visit and a $2,500 fine. Dale did not blink. Each property is evaluated on its own compliance history and current condition upon association review. We don't discuss the specifics of other owners' files. That would violate their privacy. Then how do you evaluate selective enforcement complaints? We don't have selective enforcement complaints, Dale said. We have a fine that's due in your case, Ms. Whitfield, and it's currently accruing at $100 a day. As of this meeting, that's day 9. Your balance stands at $3,400. Carol Vance, treasurer, added without being asked. The association's reserve fund covenant requires us to maintain enforcement consistency to protect property values per Section 12.1. Fines that go unpaid affect our reserve position. It was the first of many times Mara would hear the reserve fund invoked as a justification for something that had nothing to do with reserves. An older man near the back of the room, Mara didn't know his name yet, but she'd learn it was Walt Braverman, Lot 44, a retired contractor who'd built half the additions on Hollow Pine Trail himself over the years, cleared his throat and said, mostly to the room rather than to the board, "For what it's worth, that deck's built to code. I did the original inspection back when Sanderson owned it. Better built than half what's gone up since." Dale thanked him for his input, in a tone that made clear the input would not be reflected anywhere in the minutes. Roy Pemberton, secretary, spent the meeting filming from a tripod angled to capture the room's reaction to Dale's statements, rather than the statements themselves. A detail Mara noticed, and filed away without yet understanding how useful it would eventually become. The official minutes, distributed by email 4 days later, summarized Mara's 3 minutes of remarks as, "Owner of Lot 14 raised general concerns regarding enforcement, with no mention of the 4 comparable properties, the fine total, or the word foreclosure, which had been used twice by Dale himself in the room." She left that meeting $3,400 in the hole for a deck she hadn't built, on land she'd owned for 3 weeks, having just watched a board unanimously decline to explain why 4 identical violations at other cabins had gone unpunished for a decade. By the last week of October, the fine had climbed past $6,000. A second notice arrived, this one expanding the alleged violation to include a small storage shed behind her cabin, unauthorized accessory structure, Section 7.4, despite the shed having been listed, photographed, and disclosed in her own closing documents as an existing improvement conveyed with the sale. The HOA's position, delivered by Denise over the phone in the flattest tone imaginable, was that prior disclosure doesn't constitute prior approval. Mara requested the ARC meeting minutes for the years the shed and deck were originally built, to establish whether the previous owner had, in fact, sought approval and simply never received a response. A common and well-documented HOA tactic: delay a request into oblivion, then cite the resulting structure as unauthorized a decade later. The association's response, in writing, from Dale himself: records requests must be submitted in writing with a stated purpose and are subject to a 14-business-day response window per our records policy. 14 business days would put her past the cure deadline on both violations. She submitted the request anyway, in writing, that same afternoon, certified mail. She was starting, without fully realizing it yet, to build a paper trail, the first habit of every homeowner who eventually wins one of these fights, even when they don't yet know they're going to. Denise, for her part, seemed increasingly uncomfortable being the voice on the other end of Mara's calls. She wasn't a board member, just a contracted administrator paid by the hour to answer phones, process dues, and forward paperwork to whichever board president happened to be in charge that year. And more than once she let slip, in the careful, off-the-record way people do, when they know they shouldn't but can't quite help themselves, that this isn't the first time somebody's asked me why the 14-day window always seems to line up with fine deadlines. She never said Dale's name directly. She didn't have to. The shed violation stung in a way the deck fine hadn't, mostly because it was so transparently manufactured. Mara pulled her own closing disclosure that same night and found the shed listed on page 11 of the seller's property disclosure statement, photographed by the bank's own listing agent, described plainly as existing storage structure, approx 10 by 12, conveyed as is. She'd walked past it a dozen times during her home inspection. The inspector had noted its condition: good, minor roof wear, without a single flag about permitting. If it had been a problem, it had been a problem for 7 years before Mara ever saw the listing, and nobody, not the bank, not the closing attorney, not the title company, had thought it worth mentioning. She called her closing attorney's office to ask whether a title search should have caught an unresolved HOA violation before closing. The paralegal who took the call was sympathetic but blunt. Title searches catch liens and recorded violations, not unrecorded association grievances that a board decides to manufacture after the fact. In other words, there had been nothing to catch because there had been nothing wrong until the week Mara moved in and Dale Huffman decided there was. By the second week of November, the combined fines on the deck and the shed had climbed to $5,900, accruing at $200 a day now that both violations were running their own daily clocks in parallel. Mara had started keeping a spreadsheet, the same instinct that made her good at her actual job, auditing insurance claims for inconsistency, turned now on her own life, tracking every date, every dollar figure, every phone call, every name. She didn't know yet that the spreadsheet would end up as an exhibit in a records request that would eventually blow the whole board's enforcement pattern wide open. She just knew that nobody was going to threaten to take her house without her having a complete record of exactly how it happened, in order, with receipts. $6,000 and climbing. Over a deck she didn't build. Against Mara Whitfield, 3 weeks into ownership. Is this even legal where you live? What would you have done in her position? November brought the lien. It arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday. A claim of lien, filed with the Laurel Fork County Register of Deeds, recorded against the title to Cabin 14, Hollow Pine Trail, in the amount of $7,300, representing the original $2,500 base fine, accumulated daily fines through the filing date, and $1,200 in administrative and legal processing fees the association had tacked on without prior notice. Attached was a letter from a law firm, Higgins & Cole LLP, out of the county seat 40 minutes away, informing Mara that if the balance was not satisfied within 30 days, the association intended to pursue judicial foreclosure of the lien under state law, a process that could, in theory, result in the forced sale of her home to satisfy a debt that had started as a deck built by someone else, 7 years before she ever saw the property. She read the letter, standing in her own driveway, mail still in hand, and felt something shift in her chest. Not panic exactly, something colder. The particular fury of watching a system built to serve homeowners get used, with total procedural correctness, to threaten to take a home. She called the Higgins & Cole associate listed at the bottom of the letter, a young attorney named Preston Ames who sounded, if anything, faintly bored by the whole exchange, like foreclosure threats over deck setbacks were simply Tuesday. When Mara asked whether the firm had reviewed the enforcement history against comparable properties before filing, Preston said the firm's engagement was limited to collection of duly authorized association assessments and fines, and that questions about enforcement pattern were a board policy matter, not something outside counsel evaluates. It was, Mara realized afterward, a perfectly polished way of saying nobody along the entire chain. Not Dale, not Carol, not Denise at the management office, not the law firm collecting on the debt, considered it any single person's job to ask whether the fine was fair. Everyone was just doing their piece of the process, and the process, taken as a whole, was about to take her house. She looked into her legal options that same week and learned, with a kind of grim relief, that judicial foreclosure in North Carolina required the association to actually file suit and obtain a court order. It wasn't the instant, silent process some states allowed, and it would take months to reach a courtroom, even if the board pushed it all the way. That bought her time. It didn't buy her peace of mind, not with a $7,300 number sitting on a public deed record with her name and address attached to it for anyone. A future buyer, a lender, a nosy neighbor with a laptop to find. The public humiliation came next, and it came from the clubhouse bulletin board, where, apparently within the association's rights per its own governing documents, the management office posted a delinquent assessment notice listing address, lot number, and outstanding balance for any owner more than 60 days behind on fines or dues. Mara's name went up on a Friday. By Saturday, she noticed the change in how people looked at her at the little community dock. Not hostile exactly, just careful, distant. The kind of distance people keep from someone who might be contagious, with whatever trouble follows them. Thelma told her, over more sweet tea, that this too was standard Dale procedure. He doesn't have to say a word to turn the neighborhood against you. He just posts the number on the board and lets everybody assume you're some deadbeat who won't pay her dues. Doesn't matter that it's a made-up fine on a deck that was here before you were. Ed Castellano, deck owner, bourbon giver, 11 feet into the easement and never once sighted, actually crossed the road to avoid her one afternoon. It stung more than Mara expected it to. The Delacroix family, who'd waved warmly at Mara during her first week, stopped waving. When Mara ran into their teenage son at the community dock, the boy said, with the blunt honesty only a 15-year-old can manage, "My dad said not to get involved with you. Said you're about to get foreclosed and he doesn't want us associated with it." Mara didn't blame him. She blamed a system where a made-up debt could make a grown man afraid to let his kid talk to his new neighbor. Priya Ose was the one exception. She sought Mara out directly, cornering her by the mailboxes on a gray Saturday morning, and said, low enough that no one else could hear, "I tried to fight him 2 years ago. Lost my bedroom addition, and nearly lost my nerve along with it. I'm not saying that to scare you off. I'm saying it because I want you to know somebody else remembers exactly what this feels like, and I'm rooting for you, quietly, from over here." It was the first genuinely kind thing anyone connected to the board had said to Mara in 6 weeks, and she held on to it the way you hold on to anything warm in a cold month. Mara's manager at the insurance company, a woman named Denise Whitfield, no relation, an odd coincidence, Mara noted with the kind of tired half-laugh that comes from a life gone slightly absurd, began scheduling check-ins about focus and availability after Mara missed 2 internal deadlines buried under phone calls with the county recorder's office. Mara didn't explain the lien. She didn't want her employer's first real impression of her to be a story about a $7,300 debt over a deck, even one she hadn't built. She just apologized, caught up on a weekend, and kept the whole fight compartmentalized, somewhere her coworkers would never see it. Which is, if you ask anyone who's been through something like this, its own particular kind of exhausting. Her job took the hit too. She was 3 weeks into a new remote position, still trying to make a good impression on a manager she'd never met in person, and she found herself losing entire afternoons to phone calls with the county recorder's office, with her homeowner's insurance company asking pointed questions about the lien showing up on a title search they'd run for an unrelated reason, and with a mortgage broker she'd been talking to about refinancing, who informed her, apologetically, that an active lien would tank her chances of approval until it was resolved. She had moved to Timberline Ridge to get some peace. Instead, she'd inherited. She'd have laughed at the word later, if she'd known. A fight she hadn't started, over land she hadn't built on, that was now threatening the only home she had left. It was around this point, sitting at her kitchen table at 11 at night with a legal pad covered in dates and dollar amounts, that Mara decided she was done being patient about it. She started, the way most people eventually do, by looking for a lawyer. The first 2 she called wanted retainers she couldn't afford on a claims auditor's salary, not on top of a mortgage and a $7,300 lien. The third, a solo practitioner 2 counties over, told her frankly that residential HOA disputes were a slog financially, unless you've got real leverage, a clear statutory violation, a corruption angle, something that changes the math. Mara didn't have that, not yet. In the meantime, she kept building her own file, the unglamorous way most people eventually win these fights, not with a single dramatic discovery, but with a slow accumulation of paper. She filed a formal public records request with Laurel Fork County for any code enforcement or building permit history tied to Cabin 14 and the 4 comparison properties. She requested, again in writing, the ARC's original 2014 file on her own deck, and this time, with the 14 business day window having quietly expired without a response, cited the association's own bylaws records production requirement in her follow-up letter, forcing Denise at the management office to finally produce a thin, incomplete file showing that the original approval request had, in fact, been submitted by the previous owner in 2014 and had simply never received a written response of any kind from that year's ARC. Approval by abandonment, in other words, the exact same pattern as the Delacroix fire pit, just 7 years earlier, and now being used against her instead of forgotten entirely. It wasn't nothing. It was, Grace Okafor would later tell her, the kind of detail that wins you sympathy from a judge, but rarely wins you the case outright. Mara needed more, and she knew it, which was why she kept digging even before she had a lawyer signed on, pulling old newsletters from the community's history binder in the clubhouse, cross-referencing board minutes going back to the 1990s, trying to understand not just her own violation, but the shape of the whole system that had produced it. It was Thelma, again, who gave her the name that actually mattered. Thelma's grandson had used a real estate attorney in Asheville named Grace Okafor to sort out a boundary dispute a few years back, and Thelma remembered Grace as sharp as a tack and not the least bit afraid of rich men who think they run things. Mara called Grace's office on a Monday morning and had a consultation booked by Wednesday. She brought everything: the original violation notice, the lien, the Higgins and Cole letter, her own annotated copy of the CC&Rs, and, almost as an afterthought, because Grace had asked her to bring anything related to the property's history, deed, prior owners, anything, the closing binder from her purchase, including the title commitment her closing attorney had barely walked her through in the rush of signing day. Grace Okafor read for a long time without saying much, the way good lawyers do. Then she stopped on one page of the title commitment, flipped back 2 pages, flipped forward again, and said, "Do you know what a ground lease is?" "Vaguely," Mara said. "Something about renting the land under the cabin, instead of owning it outright." "That's right. Your title commitment lists your interest in the lot as a leasehold estate, not a fee-simple estate. You own the cabin structure. You lease the ground it sits on. 99 years, from 1962. That means it runs until 2061. "Okay," Mara said slowly. "And who owns the ground?" Grace turned the title commitment around and pointed to a line Mara had scrolled right past on closing day, too tired and too grieving to register it as meaningful. Fee simple title held by Whitfield Family Land Trust, Otis P. Whitfield, settlor. Mara stared at it. "That's my family. That's my great-uncle. I inherited some money from a Whitfield trust this summer, but nobody told me it had anything to do with land. Nobody told me it had anything to do with this cabin." "They may not have known to connect it," Grace said. "Trusts get administered by lawyers who process paperwork, not real estate agents selling foreclosure listings 40 minutes down the road. Different worlds. But if you inherited a distribution from the Whitfield Family Land Trust this summer, and this cabin's ground title sits in that same trust, I need to see the trust documents. Today, if you can get them." Grace walked Mara through the mechanics while they waited on the paperwork, sketching a rough diagram on a legal pad the way lawyers do when they want a client to actually understand something, rather than just nod along. "A ground lease," she explained, "splits ownership into 2 separate legal interests: the fee simple estate, which is the underlying land itself, held forever by whoever owns it outright, and the leasehold estate, which is a long-term right to use that land, held by whoever's paying rent on it, in this case, for 99 years, expiring in 2061. Cabin owners at Timberline Ridge had only ever purchased the leasehold half of that equation. The fee-simple half, the dirt itself, forever, had stayed with Otis Whitfield's trust the entire time, quietly, invisibly, a fact so buried in decades-old paperwork that even the association's own attorneys, Grace suspected, had probably never bothered to read the original 1962 lease closely enough to understand what it actually said about renegotiation. Most people who own a home don't think about the dirt underneath it separately from the house sitting on top, Grace said. Why would they? But here, they're legally two different things, owned by two different parties. And one of those parties has just spent 2 months threatening to foreclose on the other one's home over a deck. When the full trust instrument arrived from Ledbetter and Cross, Grace spent the better part of an hour walking Mara through Otis Whitfield's original 1958 language, much of it written in the kind of florid, old-fashioned legal prose lawyers don't use anymore. Otis had structured the trust to pass trusteeship down through his direct descendants, generation to generation, for so long as the corpus of the trust, namely the real property described in Exhibit A, shall remain undivided and in trust, it being the settlor's wish that the mountain not be sold off in pieces to strangers, but held whole and stewarded by his own blood. Elaine had been trustee since her own mother's death in the early 2010s, quietly collecting the modest annual ground rents from the association, paying the trust's minimal administrative costs, and otherwise never involving herself in Timberline Ridge's day-to-day governance at all. Content, it seemed, to let the homeowners run their own community and simply cash the rent check the lease required. Grace didn't know, and it wasn't in any of the paperwork, but Mara found herself thinking about it for days afterward, the strange, sad irony that her mother had, for over a decade, been the landlord of a mountain community she may have never once set foot on, and that Mara herself had ended up moving into that same community entirely by accident, drawn in by nothing more than a foreclosure listing and a search radius set to under 2 hours from Charlotte. There's one more thing you should understand before we send anything to the board, Grace said, near the end of that first long evening of paperwork. Being the trustee doesn't just give you leverage, it gives you obligations. Otis's trust language is explicit that the land is meant to be stewarded, not weaponized for personal advantage. I can absolutely use your position to stop this foreclosure and force a fair renegotiation of that lease. What I won't help you do is turn this into your own version of what Dale's been doing to everyone else. If we're going to fix this, we fix it for the whole mountain, not just for you. Mara didn't have to think long about that. That's exactly what I want, she said. I didn't move up here to run anything. I moved up here to be left alone. But if the only way to be left alone is to finally make sure nobody else gets a rolling pin morning like mine, then fine. Let's do that instead. Ledbetter and Cross, the Charlotte firm that had processed Elaine's estate paperwork over the summer, sent the full trust documents within 2 days of Grace's request. Grace called Mara back that same evening, and for the first time since Dale Huffman had walked into her kitchen holding a rolling pin's worth of bad news, Mara heard something in a lawyer's voice that sounded almost like glee. "Mara," Grace said, "you didn't just inherit a cash distribution from your mother. You inherited her successor trustee interest in the Whitfield Family Land Trust, which, per Otis Whitfield's original 1958 trust instrument, holds fee simple title to the entire 400-acre parcel underlying Timberline Ridge. Every cabin lot, every road, the clubhouse, the lake frontage, all of it. Your mother was trustee for 11 years before she passed. Now you are." Mara sat down slowly on the same kitchen chair where she'd first read Dale's violation notice. "You're telling me I own the land under my own cabin. I'm telling you you own the land under every cabin in that community, including Dale Huffman's. You are, as of your mother's death this past June, the landlord of Timberline Ridge. Every ground rent payment that association owes, they owe to your trust. Every renegotiation of the master ground lease, which, by the way, is due for its 20-year review clause this year, 2025, happens with you, or doesn't happen at all. So the fine, the lien, the foreclosure threat. They've spent 2 months trying to foreclose on a leasehold interest," Grace said, "belonging to the one person on this mountain who could, in theory, decline to renew their master lease entirely. I would very much like to be in the room when they find that out. Mara just made a critical move. She hired a real estate attorney and pulled the trust documents that had been sitting in her own closing file since day one. Was that the right call? What's your strategy when a paper trail is all you've got? Grace moved fast, and she moved carefully. The first step wasn't a lawsuit. It was a letter. On November 20th, Higgins & Cole, LLP, received a certified letter from Grace Okafor's office, on Grace's letterhead, informing the Timberline Ridge Cabin Owners Association that its client, Mara Whitfield, held the successor trustee interest in the Whitfield Family Land Trust, holder of fee simple title to the entirety of the land underlying Timberline Ridge Cabin community, and that any further collection action, lien enforcement, or foreclosure proceeding against Mara's leasehold interest at Cabin 14 would be met with, at minimum, a formal demand for an accounting of all association funds, a request for review of the master ground lease's renegotiation terms, due per the original 1962 instrument in 2025, and a referral to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division regarding potential breach of fiduciary duty by the board in its enforcement practices. The letter did not ask the board to drop the fine. It didn't need to. It simply laid out, in the driest possible legal language, exactly who Mara Whitfield actually was, and let the implications sit there like a held breath. Denise at the management office was the one who told Thelma, who told Mara, that Dale Huffman had gone white as a sheet, reading it at his kitchen table, called an emergency board meeting for the following Tuesday, and spent 45 minutes on the phone with Higgins & Cole, trying to figure out whether the trust claim could possibly be legitimate. It was. Grace had already had the trust instrument and the original 1962 ground lease recorded and cross-referenced by a title researcher in Asheville, confirming beyond any reasonable dispute that the Whitfield Family Land Trust held clear fee-simple title to all 400 acres, that the trust had never been dissolved or the land conveyed to the association, and that the association's entire 63-year existence had operated on borrowed land under a lease that was, as of 2025, legally overdue for renegotiation. A renegotiation that, per the lease's own terms, required good faith engagement from both the trustee and the association's board, and could, if the board failed to negotiate in good faith, result in the trustee declining to extend favorable terms at all. In other words, Dale Huffman had spent 2 months trying to foreclose on a woman who could, with a signature, decline to renew the ground lease that every single home in Timberline Ridge legally sat on. The emergency board meeting was moved from the clubhouse's small meeting room to its main hall, because word had spread through all 62 cabins by then, and this time 41 homeowners showed up, more than had attended a Timberline Ridge board meeting in a decade. Dale opened the meeting, trying to control the narrative, describing Mara's attorney's letter as an attempt to intimidate the board with unverified legal claims. Grace Okafor, sitting beside Mara in the second row, simply stood, walked to the podium when recognized, and placed a certified copy of the recorded trust instrument, the original 1962 ground lease, and the county's title confirmation, on the table in front of the board. "My client is not making a claim," Grace said. "She's stating a fact of public record, recorded at the Register of Deeds, available to any of you or your counsel for the cost of a copy. Mara Whitfield's family trust owns this land. All of it. The association's governing documents are built on top of a ground lease with her trust, a lease that is, this year, due for its contractual 20-year renegotiation. I'd also note, for the board's records, that continuing to pursue foreclosure action against a leasehold interest belonging to your own landlord, while that landlord is actively evaluating the terms on which she'll renew your community's entire legal right to exist on this land, might strike a neutral observer as an unusually poor negotiating strategy." The room went dead silent, except for Roy Pemberton, who had apparently forgotten he was still recording on his phone, and who could be heard, on the video that would later circulate through every cabin on Hollow Pine Trail, whispering, "Oh my God," under his breath. Walt Braverman, the retired contractor who'd tried to speak up about Mara's deck being built to code back in October, stood without being called on and said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, "I've lived on this mountain since 1994. Never once, in 31 years, has anybody told me who actually owns the ground under my own cabin." That feels like something a homeowners association exists to tell people, not hide from them. A ripple of agreement moved through the room, quiet, but unmistakable, the sound of a community that had spent years assuming Dale Huffman simply knew things they didn't, finally realizing he'd been operating with exactly the same blind spot as everyone else, and had just gotten caught holding it. Thelma, sitting beside Mara, reached over at some point during Grace's presentation and squeezed her hand, hard, without saying a word. It was the first moment since Dale had walked into her kitchen, holding a rolling pin's worth of bad news, that Mara let herself believe this might actually turn. Carol Vance, treasurer, tried a different tack, insisting the association's reserve fund and enforcement practices were entirely separate from any land ownership question, a claim that fell apart within the hour, because Mara's records request from October, the one Dale had tried to bury under a 14-business-day delay window, had finally produced documents. And those documents showed that the reserve fund Carol had invoked at Mara's very first meeting had, over the preceding 3 years, paid out over $140,000 in landscaping and maintenance contracts to a company called Huffman Grounds and Grading, LLC, a company whose registered agent, per state business filings that a furious homeowner named Priya Osei had pulled up on her phone in real time during the meeting, was Dale Huffman's brother-in-law. The fines, the selective enforcement, the reserve fund lectures. It had never really been about deck setbacks. It had been about keeping the board's enforcement machine humming, keeping homeowners scared and compliant, and keeping a very profitable landscaping arrangement quiet from the people paying for it in their dues. After everything Mara went through, was it worth it? Have you ever fought your HOA and won, or walked away instead? Tell me your story, because Mara's isn't over yet, and neither, probably, is yours. The board meeting that had started with Dale Huffman trying to spin an attorney letter as intimidation ended, 4 hours later, with a homeowner-forced special session scheduled for December, an emergency motion to freeze all pending fine collections pending independent review, and a visibly shaken Carol Vance quietly resigning her treasurer position before the meeting even adjourned. The December special session drew 55 of 62 cabin owners, the largest gathering in Timberline Ridge's history, standing room only in the clubhouse's main hall, with 3 homeowners' attorneys present, and a reporter from the Laurel Fork Courier-Times sitting in the back row after Priya Osei's video of the November meeting had racked up 11,000 views on the county's community Facebook group. Grace Okafor, representing Mara in her capacity as trustee of the land underlying the entire community, presented the trust's position plainly. The Whitfield Family Land Trust was willing to renegotiate the master ground lease for another 99 years, on fair and modest terms consistent with the community's history, provided the association agreed to a set of binding governance reforms as a condition of the new lease. Among them, an independent, third-party review of all fines issued in the preceding 5 years, with mandatory refunds for any found to reflect selective enforcement. A public, standardized enforcement log for all future violations, cross-referenced against the entire community rather than issued at a board member's private discretion. Competitive bidding, with disclosed conflicts of interest, for any association contract exceeding $5,000, and a hard cap limiting any board president to 2 consecutive terms. Dale Huffman tried, for about 6 minutes, to argue that the trust had no legal standing to condition a land lease on internal HOA governance matters. Grace's response was brief. The trust wasn't conditioning anything on internal governance out of spite. It was declining to lease 400 acres, for another 99 years, to a board that had just been shown, on the public record, funneling reserve funds to the president's brother-in-law while threatening foreclosure against a homeowner over a deck older than her own ownership of the property. If the board wanted a different landlord's terms, Grace noted dryly, they were welcome to try finding one, since the trust in question held the only fee title on the mountain. Nobody laughed, exactly, but several people came close. The reporter from the Courier-Times, a young man named Josh Tillman, who normally covered county commissioner meetings and high school football, took 4 full pages of notes and asked, during the public comment period, whether the association intended to disclose the Huffman grounds and grading contract details to the full membership before or after the vote on the new interim board. Dale's response, that information is proprietary vendor data, did not survive contact with North Carolina's public record standards for homeowner association financial disclosures, a fact Grace was happy to point out, on the record, in front of both the reporter and the 55 assembled owners. A motion was raised from the floor, seconded within seconds, to suspend Dale Huffman's authority to approve any association expenditure above $500 pending the outcome of the independent fine review. It passed 51-4, the 4 dissenting votes belonging to Dale himself, Roy Pemberton, and 2 owners nobody in the room recognized, who left before the meeting adjourned and were never seen at another one. Carol Vance's resignation, tendered quietly the previous month, was formally accepted, and Priya Ose was appointed interim treasurer on the spot, a nomination that carried by voice vote so loud and immediate that the board chair didn't bother calling for a formal count. Mara didn't say much during the special session itself. She let Grace do the talking, mostly, and sat in the second row next to Thelma, watching 62 decades worth of quiet compliance finally curdle into something else entirely. At one point, an owner she'd never met, a soft-spoken man from Lot 52, named Harold Prentice, leaned over and whispered, "I've lived here 19 years and never said one word at a meeting. Wanted you to know, I'm glad somebody finally did." Mara hadn't really said anything either, not that night, but she understood what he meant. Sometimes, just being the reason a room finally has to look at itself, honestly, counts as saying something. The independent fine review, conducted over the following 2 months by a neutral property management consultant, jointly selected by the trust and a newly elected interim board, confirmed everything Mara and Thelma had suspected from that very first library trip. 17 violation notices issued over the preceding 3 years, disproportionately against new owners and homeowners who had publicly disagreed with Dale at a meeting, while at least 11 comparable or worse violations, including Ed Castellano's shed and the Ose family's porch, had gone entirely unenforced. Every disputed fine tied to Mara's case was reversed. The $7,300 lien was released and expunged from the county record within a week of the special session, at Grace's insistence, with a formal letter of correction sent to every credit and title service that had been notified of the original filing. Dale Huffman did not run for a 4th term. He didn't get the chance to. A recall petition, circulated by Priya Ose and signed by 44 of 62 homeowners within 11 days of the December meeting, forced a special election in January, and Dale withdrew from consideration rather than face a vote he had no realistic path to winning. Huffman Grounds and Grading's contract was terminated at the same meeting, and the association's new interim board opened all future landscaping and maintenance contracts to competitive, disclosed bidding for the first time in the community's history. By spring, the new ground lease was signed, 99 years, modest rent increases, tied to a transparent formula rather than a board's discretion, and the governance reforms built directly into the lease as binding conditions, so that no future board could simply vote them away once the cameras and the county reporter had moved on to the next story. Priya Ose ran for the interim board that January and won, unopposed this time, with 51 of 62 homeowners casting a vote. More than 5 times the turnout Dale had ever faced in 6 years of elections. Her first act as board vice president was to formally reopen her own bedroom addition application, approved within 3 weeks under the new competitive and transparent ARC process, 7 months after the original denial that had quietly ended her first campaign against Dale. Walt Braverman, the retired contractor, volunteered to sit on the newly created independent ARC review panel, a role that carried no vote and no real power beyond making sure every future application got an actual, documented, timely answer, instead of Dale's old strategy of silence until it became convenient to call something unauthorized. The Laurel Fork Courier-Times ran a follow-up piece in March under the headline, "Mountain Community's New Landlord Was Hiding in Plain Sight," which Thelma clipped out and taped to her refrigerator, to Mara's mild embarrassment and, if she was honest with herself, quiet pride. The reporter had asked Mara, near the end of the interview, whether she planned to use her position as trustee to make any other changes to the community. Mara had thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I don't want to run this place," she'd said. "I just wanted my rolling pin. But I guess once you find out you're standing on ground that was always yours to begin with, it's hard to pretend you don't have a say in what happens on it." The Independent Fine Review's final report, delivered to the full membership in April, ran to 31 pages and made for grim reading even for people who thought they already knew how bad things had gotten. Of the 17 violation notices issued over 3 years, 13 were found to reflect enforcement inconsistent with comparable unenforced conditions elsewhere in the community, a pattern the consultant's report described, in language considerably more careful than anything Thelma had used over sweet tea, as enforcement discretion applied in a manner correlated with the recipient's tenure, prior board relations, or history of dissent, rather than with objective compliance criteria. Refund checks went out to 9 homeowners that May, totaling just over $26,000, funded not from the reserve account Dale had spent years lecturing people about, but from a line item the new board created, specifically labeled, without much subtlety, enforcement corrections. Dale Huffman put his cabin on the market that same spring. Whether he left because of the recall, the refund checks, the newspaper headline, or simply the accumulated weight of every neighbor now looking at him the way people had once looked at Mara on the community dock, nobody could say for certain, and nobody much cared to ask. He sold Lot 3 in June to a young couple from Charlotte, who, as far as anyone could tell, had no idea whose kitchen table the whole reckoning had once been planned around, 3 miles down the mountain, over a legal pad and a pot of coffee. Mara Whitfield still lives at Cabin 14, Hollow Pine Trail. The deck is still there, the same one Dale Huffman stood in her kitchen and called a 6-figure threat to the neighborhood's property values on her second day of ownership. It's still 6 feet into the old easement line, technically. Nobody has mentioned it since. She and Thelma still drink sweet tea on the porch most evenings. Ed Castellano brought her a bottle of the same bourbon he used to bring Dale every Christmas, which she took as an apology, and which she has not yet decided whether to accept. She never asked to be anyone's landlord. She bought a foreclosed cabin off an auction website at 1 in the morning because she needed somewhere quiet to rebuild a life that had just lost her marriage and her mother in the same 18 months. But it turns out the mountain her great-uncle dammed up a creek on 67 years ago was patient in a way people rarely are, and it waited until exactly the wrong week for exactly the wrong board president to find out who he'd actually been fining all along. There's a version of this story where Mara never calls Grace Okafor, never asks for the trust documents, never connects a dead great-uncle's mountain to the foreclosure listing she found scrolling her phone at 1 in the morning. In that version, she pays the fine, quietly, the way most people do, because fighting an HOA on a claims auditor's salary rarely looks like a fight worth having. Dale Huffman keeps his landscaping contract. Priya Osei never runs again. Thelma keeps pouring sweet tea for whichever new owner gets the rolling pin treatment next. The only difference between that version and this one is $11 worth of photocopies at a public library, and a woman too stubborn to sign a check for a deck she didn't build without first understanding exactly why she was being asked to. If your HOA has ever made you feel small in your own driveway, in your own kitchen, on your own land, you already know there's usually more going on underneath it than they'll ever volunteer to tell you. Sometimes it's corruption, sometimes it's just cowardice, dressed up as bylaws. And every once in a great while, it's a title report nobody bothered to read closely enough, sitting quietly in a closing binder, waiting for somebody to finally open it. Subscribe for the next one. Somebody's HOA is about to find out exactly who they've been messing with.